学数就
It's our honor to have Professor Shani Orgad to be on our channel.
It's an honor to be here, really a pleasure.
Would you mind briefly introduce your book theme and your research?
My book is called Heading Home, Motherhood, Work and the Failed Promise of Equality. Really what animates the book is a puzzle, paradox if you wish, educated women who particularly grew up in a cultural and policy climate that champions women's successful combining motherhood and paid employment and economic activity. Why do they then quit? So I was particularly interested in a group of women who actually can afford the help in terms of childcare that would allow them to stay in paid employment. Why do they choose to be stay-at-home mothers, sometimes referred to as housewives as well? It seems to be against our times, It is a minority group of women, although unfortunately now it's getting bigger and bigger, largely due to the pandemic. So specifically here in the UK, just by examining the statistics, and I found that 20% of women who are stay-at-home mothers are women who are also highly educated. And in the US, we're talking about a quarter of stay-at-home mothers having college degrees. And I know my Chinese students and colleagues that there's a similar phenomenon happening in China. More personally, and I think a lot of our research is often kind of grounded in our personal experience. I live in London and I live in a leafy, kind of green, nice, pretty middle class generally neighborhood. And I have two children, they're now teenagers, but when they were younger, I would normally in the morning drop them off at school. So you wait at the school gate until they open the school gate to let the children go into their classes. And I was surrounded by other women who were mothers like me, who I knew were previously in professional jobs. So they were lawyers, they were teachers, engineers, artists, fashion designers, accountants, you name it. And they all, or not all of them, but many of them I knew were now no longer in work. And it often kind of really made me curious, why is it that they are, made a choice, but I never asked. And one day as I was rushing to work, because I would drop off my kids just before 9 o'clock, which is really a late start, but that's how the UK system works, dashing off to be at central London by normally 10 when I start lecturing. So I was like in this haste. And I would often be in my suit for the working day, and they would be like in, sweatpants or kind of quite casual. And one of the women kind of approached me and I said, are you coming? Are you joining us? We're going to have a coffee. They used to have coffee mornings, all the mums who were no longer in paid employment. And I said, oh no, I'm sorry. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm dashing off. And she said, where are you going? And I said, oh, I'm off to work. And she kind of paused and she looked at me with a pitying look. And she said, oh, poor thing. And I really puzzled, genuinely puzzled. I thought, why is she feeling sorry for me? I knew that this woman specifically she worked in an big accountancy company, and she was quite senior. And I thought, what is it about this is there some trauma there that she's sorry for me that I'm going to work in the morning? And this kind of triggered my interest. The women I interviewed were generally in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and they came of age amid a big promise, a promise that was fed and nourished by a very prominent cultural and policy climate that encouraged women to pursue their choices across all spheres of life. That's what Angela McRobbie, who's a feminist scholar, what she called the new sexual contract. This promise also was a promise that their parents iterated to them. A lot of these women grew up in working class families here in Britain. So their parents couldn't make these choices. The parents encouraged them to go and gain higher education and then go to the world of work to pursue careers and professional careers. None of the women I interviewed, no one woman said, I'd ever imagined myself to become stay-at-home mother. That wasn't the contract. So the failure is the failure of the social conditions to meet this contract. My critique is not of the women as individuals. That's not their failure. They internalize it as a failure. They often blame themselves. But the failure is a failure that is societal, that is structural. It's a failure of workplaces, it's a failure of government, it's a failure of the media partly in perpetuating very punitive, often insidious messages, narratives, and images. Harley Orchard, American sociologist, writes about it in her very important book, The Second Shift, where she describes the woman with the flying hair, this image that kind of in the 80s, but we can still see today to an extent, this woman with the briefcase in one hand, a baby in her other, and this kind of ideal image of the balanced woman. And the failure is really against these often disciplinary images that keep haunting the women I interviewed.
And actually, all the historical context seems very weirdly familiar to me. And you mentioned structural inequality in the workplace. I think it's a hidden insight for many people when they judge those stay-at-home mothers. So would you mind also tell us a bit about those maybe very nuanced gender inequality in the workplace, how it has become internalized by these females and led them to make this free choice to stay at home?
So I think in relation to the workplace, one of the key findings from my research was that women's decision to leave paid employment was what one of the women I interviewed called the forced choice. And it was forced by a range of factors. Many of those factors had to do with the workplace and specifically with what I call toxic work cultures. They have an ideal employee available 24/7. When we talk about those toxic work cultures and long hour work cultures, we imagine bankers, lawyers, what was once called the greedy professions. In fact, most professions, if not all professions, are now these greedy professions. This new normal of working all the time has become quite pervasive. There's no internalization of the idea that these employees are also having caring responsibilities, let alone having other lives. Some of these workplaces had on paper, they had flexible policies, but in practice, when it came to ask for your boss to say, tomorrow I need to leave early because my son has an hospital appointment, the boss would say, oh no, we have this really important meeting with clients, you can't. I think one of the things that are really critical that have come out from my book is that it's not enough, and in fact it's wrong, to have all this debate in relation to women only. I interviewed, I should say, only women who were in heterosexual arrangements. I think there's interesting research that comes from non-heterosexual families. We can talk about it. But in fact, one of the fundamental factors that pushed the women I spoke to out of the workforce was the lack of flexibility and the toxicity of the workplace of their husbands. I interviewed, for instance, a woman who was a lawyer, and she worked as a legal advisor for a government office. And she said, my employer is great and they give me the flexibility I need. The problem was that even though she had quite a flexible and accommodating work, her husband was a top senior media producer. He would leave home at 5 a.m., come home after 10 in the night. So she was almost single mothering, if you wish. I'm thinking a lot about this pandemic because many are hoping or have hoped that this pandemic will really show that, for instance, this emphasis on what's called presentism, be in the office, is not important. But here we are, we're all doing our jobs from home. So there's lots of hopes about ways in which perhaps structurally things may change, but I think there's also mounting evidence now that things are all actually going backwards. Flexibility, or the idea of flexibility, is not like a plaster. You need to really deeply rethink where our priorities are as a society. Do we value things that are not productive in the very narrow sense? How do we define productivity?
Maybe we can invite Guojia to talk about her finding, because she is also researching on the post-feminism media representation in China.
Basically, my research is about Chinese young middle-class women. Most of my interviewees, they are not married. A lot of my interviewees, especially those audiences, have the full-time work in the companies. Even there's some of them that's still single, but the balance between work and the family is still a big problem. They are concerned every day. And another point I want to add, my research is about social media. So this whole social media industry kind of creates an illusion for some young women, they think if I have a kid, I can just do something on social media, I can be an influencer. And on the other hand, I can just have time to take care of my kids, to enjoy my family life. A lot of young women, they think it's a really good idea, or that's possible, just to rely on this internet economy to have the security of the life.
One of the chapters in my book deals with it, because all the women, or most of the women I interviewed, had this precise dream that you're describing that Chinese young women are holding on. They had it as the idea of the mompreneur, that they can do, have their child crawl under the kitchen table while they are doing their fantastically successful business. How many women or how many people in the world we know that have done this? So it's a really fundamental myth that I think it's such an important job that you're doing to debunk.
And this leads to another question asked by the follower, also a very controversial question haunting on us, is that there was a rural school's headmistress criticized female students from rural village to be a housewife. You came all the way to go to universities, to have a career. Do you think this woman bear a responsibility to be more progressive?
I feel that women are all the time being responsibilized, all the time. The contemporary culture tells women the problem is you and the solution is you. And why are women not successful in the workplace? Because they lack sufficient confidence. Hold yourself, breathe, work on yourself. Every day there's bombardment of messages about improving yourself, taking responsibility. My forthcoming book with my colleague Rosalind Gill is called The Confidence Culture, and we really tackle this head on. So, they would tell me, look, my workplace didn't give me the flexibility I need. My boss was this. The structure of the government didn't support. They were laying out all the structural problems, and then they said, I wasn't good enough, if I only had more ambition. And in one of my interviews, I interviewed a woman who studied for 7 years medicine. Her dream was to become a geneticist. And I said to her, how can you say that you lack ambition? Look what you've done. You've put 7 years from your life, you studied, and she said, yeah, you're right. No, but you know what? If I had the ambition, it's my fault. So I feel that as feminist researchers, we should really resist that. I don't want to come with a message that says women are responsible as individuals. I think that's where the danger. Blaming women as individuals is just what the spirit of the global market wants us to carry on doing. That's what helps patriarchy stay in place. The critique and the blame, but also the change should be demanded from governments, should be demanded from workplaces, from institutions. Now, do women have a role to play in this? Of course they do. But crucially to me, not as individuals, not as in a psychological way where you have to work on yourself and say, oh, I wasn't good enough. I would want and hope that these frustrations and deep disappointments that we share as women can be channeled into anger and into collective mobilization to change structures, not to change ourselves. The fundamental question is, why do women give up? Why I don't know the specific case, but why the head teacher, the case that this head teacher was commenting it, why do women, if there's a phenomenon that happens that women are having gained their education, are quitting and making a choice that seems indeed puzzling to become housewives, why is it? Now, again, I want to put in brackets to say some women might want to make a choice to be full-time mothers, and that's absolutely fine. I don't want, as a woman, to criticize another woman for the choices she makes. My study, at least, and the women I spoke to, suggest that it's far from a choice, that it's a forced choice, that it's not something that they do as a private, free, independent decision. It was a decision that was they were pushed to make in a context of a society and a culture and workplaces that are utterly incompatible with family life and with parenting. Some of the work that women do have to do, I think, and again, with their partner, is at home. So the other side in my study is not just the workplace, but what's happening in marriage. and in relationships. You can't talk about egalitarianism at work if you don't look at what happens at home. Women are doing much more still, and in the pandemic now, even exponentially more of the unpaid labor. Other research are what they call unequal egalitarianism. So it's kind of an arrangement where we know things are not working. We know it's not equal, but we present the myth of egalitarian couple. So, these are liberal couples and they say, oh yes, we share everything equally. But then when you come to say, okay, what do you do and what do? You see that it's a very unequal egalitarianism. There, I think, yes, women and men or partners have responsibility to try and arrive egalitarianism. The women I spoke to, and very rarely did they have any conversation with their male partners about this really momentous decision to leave work. They said it just happened. So this lack of communication, of talking about things, of working out how can we arrive and reach a more egalitarian arrangement, there I think women have responsibility, but it's not their own responsibility. The onus should not be, is enough all the time put on women. It should be on men and women and on society at large.
But in the very beginning of this interview, you also mentioned, although you didn't get a chance to interview that woman, but she had this emotion of seeing you going to work as a poor thing. So is there a complex or even contradictory dilemma of judgment of their own self in this choice?
Absolutely right. That's why it's so fascinating. And I think there's lots of contradictions there. What I saw for many years when I would drop off my kids, these happy women who made a happy choice and they're going to have a jog in the park and then they're going to have a cup of coffee. They feel sorry for me. So that's the story you see. Behind this happy story, there's a much more complicated one. I really appreciate the women I interviewed for. They are so candid and honest. So the you poor thing is part of the denial, is part of the story that a lot of them leave and choose to leave, that they made a good choice. And again, I want to emphasize it. I don't want to idealize working life and say what these women should have done is stay in the workplace, but it's not a solution that has made them feel satisfied. One of the questions that I keep raising in the book is that if these women that I interviewed, who are privileged women, if they find it difficult, almost impossible, to challenge those structures, less privileged women would find it harder still because they have much more to lose. The women I interviewed could afford losing their income. These women that are less privileged can't afford that. And so to challenge structures in the workplace can cost them their livelihood. The solution must come through collective mobilization and collective thinking. The onus is not on women as individuals to carry on the burden of challenging and changing.
Another question is, do you think when there's non-heterosexual family and they also bear child, do you think there is also a similar inequality in the family, or do you think non-heterosexual family could challenge the patriarchy you just mentioned?
There is really interesting research that shows that same-sex couples divide up. So in terms, for instance, of the division of labor at home, and egalitarianism at home, they divide up things much more equally. But I think what the research I'm familiar with has shown also, and this is troubling, is that when gay and lesbian couples have children, they often begin to divide things in heterosexual ways. When they have children, the one who is high earning becomes what is in the heterosexual model often the male, and the one who is earning less becomes the carer. So falling back to the familiar breadwinner carer model, which is the heterosexual model. But in Sweden, there was an interesting study of a lesbian couple which showed that when one of the mothers gave birth, she took a pay cut that was similar to heterosexual mothers, So the kind of what is often called the motherhood penalty, where women's income goes down because they are out for maternity leave. So the woman, what was interesting at the same time in this Swedish study is that 5 years later, she managed, women in lesbian couples, the mother did catch up with the income, whereas with heterosexual families, you're staying behind. So there's something to be said there. I also, there's early research about transgender people. And again, it's really interesting to see how the research, at least that I'm familiar, shows that transgender people actually divide the chores along kind of masculine and feminine lines. The heteronormative patriarchal models are very stubborn and very strong indeed. This is where contemporary work, for instance, of Sophie Lewis, who's a really interesting feminist researcher, and she's written a book that's called Surrogacy Now. And she doesn't mean like that we all should become surrogate mothers, but she basically asks, alongside many other feminists today, what would happen if we abolish this kind of idea of the family within the heteronormative framework, and think about what she calls the proliferation of care relations, so that there is and that it's as a society we are committed to arranging and supporting care. And we talked a lot about workplaces genuinely supporting care and family life in ways that are not based on the heteronormative model and heteronormative framework. Until we get there, it'll take a lot of work. But I think that's the direction, rather than just thinking that the fact that, gender roles will somehow change by themselves, especially this kind of axis, this intersection of family and work. And workplaces really are crucial. So long as these toxic work cultures carry on, I think we will see, even within gay couples, still this kind of very fundamental inequality and injustice persisting.
Thank you very much, Professor Shani Orgad, for all your fabulous talks. 然后有一次我们在一个线下活动，然后大家就经常问我要怎么做 feminist， 哎呀我这样做，哎呀我有的时候特别宠我男朋友怎么的，然后就有一个女生就站起来说，我是一个什么什么，但是我怎么，就是我觉得这个他当时提出这个游戏的时候，我觉得对我来说非常的 liberating， 就是我意识到说，就作为一个女性吧，可能我还是太习惯要我是完美的前提下，我才可以去做出什么下一步斗争或者 be a model。就永远的陷入那个自我 correcting 的过程了。
就是你批判的这些东西，什么资本主义、新自由主义，可是你每天也在生活在这个里面。我觉得就是我们这个领域最有魅力的就是它可以把这种 contradictory 直接展示出来嘛。
就比如说很多，我觉得比如说 Anglophone 的 scholars， 他们研究这种比较个人出发的东西，最后肯定会说不要怪个人，我们要有 collective movement。但这个 collective movement 又是下一步非常tricky 的点。
中国学生做这个痛苦的就会你发现最后都是无解的，就是如果你从生活中的各种细微的，你肯定会看到很多希望。
就很多时候我觉得这条路哪怕到现在都是在非常非常初期的少量人在探索阶段，在觉得很绝望的同时，我也还是能看到就是很多空间，都不是完全没有希望，就是但是每一步都很累很累很累。